Lawrence, and as mentioned, he will speak on what democracy entails and so forth.
As you know, that's one of my favorite subjects. Having had many years in civil rights and economic development and human rights, and having been able to...
Take the microphone a little bit closer. I know you got a strong voice, but...
I hope this is fine. Okay. I know I'm pretty loud sometimes. I welcome this opportunity to hopefully raise an issue in each of your minds, those that who will review this particular panel as they have other panels, and getting a clearer understanding of truthfully what democracy is. But before I do that, I want to again thank all of the previous panels, and especially the last one with Dr. Bassat, Dr. Friedman, and Dr. Williams. That was an exceptionally good panel. And it's the kind of panel that you need to have more than 1 hour. It was well lively, well informative, intellectual, and I think anybody and everybody understood the communication, the message being sent, the necessity of owning your own and building your own dichotomy. And when you have panelships like that, and what was said between both of my colleagues to my left but to your right, they couldn't be more succinct in leaving a message that if you do not have democracy, you can expect to have the type of government not just borders on dictatorship, but it mutes the growth and development of that nation. And I'm pleased to give you an understanding of what capitalism truly means. Democracy cannot exist without capitalism. They are inextricably tied together. If you separate one from the other, you have a slow, evolving, developmental community. And you border on those who are left behind. Democracy means that everybody have an opportunity for full inclusion. Democracy will not work under communism. Democracy will not work under Marxism, socialism, and neither will it work under fascism. Oftentimes we take too much for granted as expecting that a perfect society will allow us to do almost anything that we choose to. And it's always at the expense of the underclasses. And I'm so pleased that you brought up the issue of Plato's Republic. Plato's Republic, Dr. Mayabi, which you already know, and those that have had the opportunity to read that some years ago, to synthesize it, its singular message is that no matter how ignorant you are, if you're wealthy, no matter how slow that you are, if you're wealthy, you should still lead the pack. You should still tell others who are less fortunate how to develop all societies. And what happened in the past is it led to revolutions and revolts because the kings and monarchies of that era believed, because they were in that position of the royal blood, that they were to remain in charge. But what history has reflected, with the exception of few, is that that's no longer the case. Democracy breeds an opportunity out of necessity. And when that necessity is denied, you will have the people themselves of every single nation going against the wealthy or those who are in power. And if we look at our own structure in the United States, you have 1% of the population owning more than 47% of all the wealth in America. I don't begrudge anybody's economic opportunities to ascend to power, but it should never be at the expense of those who are less fortunate to do for themselves. A displacement of class based on ethnicity, on color, on any other thing other than what's right, humanly right. Human rights has its place. If you have democracy, you will have, essentially, human rights. When you deny that from any group of people, you set yourself up for destruction. Democracy says that I am in you. I am in your mind, your blood, and your heart, and you are in my flag. If you look at the flags of the world, they denote who and what they are. Oftentimes you will see the red, white, and blue are Christian nations, most of the time. Yellow, green, black, or red, any combinations, there are oftentimes the Muslim community. It depends. But you have to look at that flag, that with which they honor, support, and respect. And it tells you of the stories of economic growth and to where they are in the process of including all of their people. A concern I've had for many years is that when I look at Africa, the richest continent on the entire planet Earth, and they are often in destitute and misery. And we've asked our questions to many people, why is this a fact? The realization is that those who have gone to Africa have extracted so much of her wealth and used the justification that it's in the form of moving people forward into the 21st century, which is almost over. We have to look at those who are attempting to not destroy necessarily, but to take whatever they feel they have a right to do at the expense of the development of that country. And what aids in that process is that tribalism is a breeding ground for it. Tribalism is the most destructive element that exists of people in Africa doing harm to themselves. If you don't belong to that tribe, therefore, you rarely will have an opportunity for employment or to participate in the mainstream of economic growth of that country. While others hold on to power for 30, 40, 50 years because they want to remain royal in its capacity. It serves no good to the future of that country. Those kingdoms have had their time, and they must change as the world changes. The same as technology has come upon us, we all have to make those adjustments. There was a time when there were no airplanes. You still had to make the adjustment. There was a time when we didn't have cell phones. You still had to make that adjustment. There was a time when we didn't have electricity, refrigerators. You had to make the adjustment accordingly. In all of those countries that felt it was wrong to make that transition have been left behind, only to find out at a later date they are not employing the key subject in being able to attain that is democracy. You allow those who become more educated. And as I've said oftentimes, if you retard a nation, it's so easily done historically when you exclude women from the mainstream, when they remain uneducated. As long as they have an opportunity for growth, that nation moves forward because they do what? They educate the nation. They educate the children. They set up the premises for democracy. Every war fought has been based primarily on democracy, whether one succeeds at it or is unsuccessful. And those who don't succeed hold on to something that's old and rotten and stinks of the worst stench you can imagine, and say it's in the name of royalty. Now, I'm very pleased to hear the comments made by several of the participants in this conference. And I was extremely excited to hear comments made by Dr. Freeman. He talked about the growth and development of Africa as a whole. That is the infrastructure that we have to deal with. Bringing railroads to the center, if not across the entire continent of Africa, creates jobs in the core of the countries, all of them collectively. Wherever there's a railroad, you find new housing becoming a reality, new jobs becoming a reality, better schools, better educated people. You're able to get product to and one point to another very comfortably. It's no longer an issue for health services. Those who know Africa, other parts of the world, know that in between some nations or within the countries themselves, the people themselves have to travel 150 miles to the nearest hospital. And by the time that becomes a reality, the person is deceased, unable to get resources to help in the healing process. Boca Raton, in its efforts to dominate its philosophy, it's always at the expense of the future of what they say they choose to achieve. We have all heard dictators and what their interests have always been focused on self-aggrandizement, self-philosophy, and commanding that all parties involved adhere to their philosophy. And again, it's at the expense of not including a democratic process. We have one that works most often in this country. We have a circumstance currently which challenges the democracy of America. America has written into the Constitution itself safeguards to protect herself against external invasion. If for some reason the Senate of the United States becomes overwhelmed and the House of Representatives with enemies of the country, the state of Texas automatically breaks up into 5 separate states. So instead of having 2 senators and a fewer congresspersons, they now have 10 in 5 separate states. That's a safeguard. The Electoral College was designed to provide that, but in the last election it didn't work the way it should have worked. And at this point in time, the nation is suffering from the difficulty of poor leadership. And we cannot blame those who were victorious in leadership no more than anyone could have blamed the Hitler ascension to power. It was what the people believed would be good for Germany, as we believe those who voted for this current president would be good for power. Oftentimes, those who are zealots in the area of power look for the denomination of being able to control everything by having specific people to support the issue. I know that we don't have a lot of time, but I want to hit on the essential things that are relevant in terms of democracy. Freedom itself does not mean that we're free under a democratic process at all. Freedom says that you have the foundation to do better if you follow basic principles and rules under human rights. Human rights is demanded where those are doing poorly. necessity has no respect for man's laws, and we must remember that. Absolutely no respect for man's laws. Necessity. Necessity denotes economic rights, which can only come under a democracy. And a democracy cannot exist under anything else but and with capitalism. So we look forward to bettering our society in understanding that the government we currently have, again, back to mentality. Mr. Trump is used to being the employer of all of those who are engaged in his corporations. He is the boss. When he became elected to the presidency of the United States, he became an employee. And that's difficult for him because he's never been an employee in his history before. And to make the transition has become markedly hard and difficult for him to make that transition. Maybe in time, if we had more time. But as it exists, he has to recognize that the Congress of the United States, the House of Representatives, and the Senate of the United States are his employers and the people of the United States. If he can accept that transitional ideology, he will be in a position at some point, if not now, whenever that occurs, to rule in a more factitious manner, not at the expense of the American people. I look forward to any questions that you have, and we're all interested in responding as we are at your pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. At this point, I will forgo the prerogative of the moderator.
China. I've been to China 4 times, and I work with some key people there in China towards a program to create 85 million jobs for the Chinese. I was blessed to have that opportunity. They're building a water canal from the west coast to the east coast out to the Yellow Sea. And it will create 85 million jobs and lift 60 million people out of poverty. I want to see the whole for the United States and for Africa in the same process. What I also encouraged, as I was a member of the board of Pan China, which is a very large economic board in China itself, I encouraged at every opportunity that I had the Chinese to invest in Africa. And the reason I did so, in my group, I was the only non-Chinese, is that other nations have ignored the needs of Africa, but they continue to extract the resources and benefit from it in Africa. And they want us to accept that philosophy. I know you don't, and I'm one of those that do not accept that because it's backward. If they want the resources of Africa, they have to have some vested interest by including them in the economic process of Africa. But because of the dissension, the disorganization amongst the African nations themselves, and they want to retain tribalism, we don't get the kind of response we expect coming from them. But out of necessity, those countries within the country will continue the work towards independence. If there somehow becomes, in the very near future, which I think is going to happen, a federal commission will come into existence, which will help govern water, electricity, oil, other minerals that relate to the country's benefit. There'll be a sharing of it out of necessity, which will continue to breed greater levels of democracy, where they learn how to work together towards a common good. I'm glad you're familiar with the Little Saigon in Virginia, of how so many people of Asian extraction that don't know each other opened up businesses in one single shopping mall. And they don't speak each other's languages, but they understood one thing: they are Asian. I learned from what they have done. I know you have. Anyone who gets exposed to it. So the potential as Africa as a continent continues to evolve, it will become a reality, maybe not in our time to see it in full totality, but it eventually will become a reality. They're leaving a legacy that our children's children can benefit from. This doesn't exclude white participation, Asian participation. It just says you have to respect my nation. You have to respect my continent. You have to respect us as people, irrespective of the color of our skin. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Dr. Tilleman?
I'm not sure which of the questions. I'm going to just pick up on the question of democracy or stability. I think that's one of the questions that you asked. I think that when we look at our continent, it is a continent that is in transition. And also, the African continent also has its own history, so it's very difficult to compare it to other parts of the world. A lot of times, this question comes up to say, look, Singapore is one of the most developed countries. It's very well structured. Singapore didn't have democracy. In fact, when Lee was the president from 1959, he took power up to, I think, he stayed in power until 1990. He stayed 31 years in power. There was no democratic process. But Singapore is a very well-developed country. So democracy is not a perfect concept. I believe that it's an imperfect concept, but it's the best for Africa that we can use from my perspective. Democracy will bring stability. If we look at what's happening in Africa right now, you have countries that have changed constitution. Presidents that have changed constitution. By so doing, they're violating the democratic process. For instance, in Congo-Brazzaville, the president of Congo changed the constitution it was 2016, people died. Burundi, the president changed the constitution, people died. I mean, you can go example after examples where leaders are changing constitutions. And so, when there's a democratic system in place, it will bring stability. Because stability, people need to have a certain set of values that allows them to be respected by all the people. And also to abide with those rules. And so the problem we have in Africa is not the type of rules that we have. The problem is that we have a poor leadership. That people who are in position of power are not respecting the democratic process they have. And so to answer your question, yes, I believe that democracy, it's not either or. It's not democracy or stability. But I believe that stability is broad. We cannot reach stability if we have a democratic process in places. So that's what I think.
Yeah, I'll just add, I think, to your point about democracy on the African continent. Democracy isn't one size fits all, right? We keep talking about Africa, but Africa is not monolithic, right? There's 54 countries, there's scores of ethnic groups. So I think democracy will change from country to country, but foremost what's important is respect for human rights and respect for freedom of political participation. It has to come from ground up. People need to have a voice in establishing these democracies.
Thank you. We have room probably for one more question.
No, actually, the question I want to ask, since you knew the answer to your question, I wanted to see what else your question. You mentioned that you were asking these questions, but you already had an answer. So if you can share just briefly and then to get back, if you don't mind, Eric, I'm just asking.
Sure.
Yeah, it's just, let me put it this way. I have an answer, but if I had an answer that would actually help the continent, or if anybody had that one size fits all or whatever answer, then that person would be a millionaire or billionaire actually. But I have an answer which I think could work, but then it has to stand the test of time. And that is, you hit the nail on the head when you gave the example of Singapore, and of course South Korea, and of course China. Because if the end goal, I think I don't know if any of you answered that about what the end goal is. Because the end goal, if it's economic development that we're pursuing in having a democratic system, then we don't really need to be pursuing democracy to achieve that. But I think Carl mentioned human rights. So if it's human rights and the dignity of mankind that we're pursuing, then yes, democracy becomes extremely important. But then the question becomes, what kind of democracy? Did Africa actually have a democracy before in its own way? Does Africa need to actually tailor democracy to its own social, economic, institutional, historical conditions? That will become the next question. What criteria do we use to determine what is democracy? A case-by-case basis. There's not one single size fits all, as I think Carl alluded, and I think Bland and you all alluded to that. So the question becomes, how do we, and also is democracy not organic? Does it sort of take shape immediately in every country? I'm throwing that out there, but there's somewhat obvious answers, which is yes, 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 yes. In other words, there's not one size fits all. It's a process that has to be homegrown. It has to be tailored to each specific country based on its own, the country's social, economic, institutional, financial, cultural conditions. Based on that, then you have to start talking, what's the criteria we're using to determine what is is it fair elections? Beyond fair elections, it has to be a process driven, in which case, even if you elect somebody, a politician, and you had fair elections, you need to have information flow, meaning free press, to provide information to the elected. And also, is democracy not indicative, whoever they elect, is that not indicative of the people? Because it's for the people, by the people, and for the people. So if you have a class drunk that you elect as the class prefect of your class, isn't that indicative of you that elected them? So it's a long it's a very deep conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let me respond to that, just in brief. You just identified what democracy is. What I mean by that, the Constitution of the United States is our democratic democracy. It guarantees a Republican way of government. Well, in that process, it allows the Nazi Party to exist in America. It allows the skinheads to exist. It allows the socialist and communist parties to exist. That's what democracy is. It's tolerant of the ill-doings and wrongs of any nation or any concept of someone's thoughts. That's what it is. The seed planted has a great opportunity under the structure of a clause of fairness, when you don't find as much fairness as we would like within the constraints of U.S. law. And you'll see it in our court systems. If a federal agency accuses you of some wrongdoing, just the agency, whether you've done anything or not, they are the investigator. This is without going to trial. This is without going to court, where you cannot exercise your rights, but it's still democratic. They are the investigators. They are the police. They are the prosecutors, they are the judge, and they're the jury. This is the United States. It's agencies under federal guidelines which correct the states themselves. So that's an oversight of the entire development and workings of this nation as a whole. So the Constitution does what? It provides you the opportunity to be tolerant of others' shortcomings.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's very good.
On that note,
that.
I know that Dr. Tadema wanted to issue a response to what was said, but I would ask that the panelists also use this opportunity to take a 1 minute to close it out, if you would.
Yeah, I think I'm very concerned about the state of Africa, African countries. Our history is very complex because actually, as I said earlier, I think you missed that, democracy existed in Africa. It's not a European concept. You can find kingdom in Africa, as I mentioned, the Mosi Kingdom, the Congo Kingdom, the Sangai Kingdom, the Mali Kingdom. All those kingdoms had democratic structure that were built within those countries. But all of it was lost when colonization took place. The restructure of Africa within these new artificial boundaries created condition where we as Africans have lost so much of what we had, our identity. And as you said, Africa is a huge continent with different culture and different concepts and different values. So we could find similarities, but today we are faced with the boundaries that we have. What do we have? What do we do when you have within one country a different group, ethnic group that did not get along, but they have to exist because they coexist because it's a one nation, one country. And which rules would they be living together? So it has to be, you take in the case of Rwanda, for instance, there are places where 10% of, I believe, of the population is Tutsi and 90% of is Hutu. And so when you have a country that is based in that has that connection, and the elements of tribalism was established, put in that place where people are going to vote, not based on the program of the president, based on the tribal values. So we have a very complex issue that we need to navigate in Africa. But at the end of the day, a system that has allowed a fair decision and people to get in position of power through a democratic process without changing the laws that we have agreed on, the referendum that have been placed in some of these African nations, where we respect the constitution that we have. And so it's an evolving process, but I think it cannot be compared to other parts of the world because of our history. So to conclude, I believe that Africa will succeed. There's a transition, but the leadership for me is the key. We need to have the right people in position of leader. We have seen one leader in one African country, which is Ethiopia. What the President Ahmed has been able to do in 1.5 years, has been able to change that nation. So leadership, us Africans who have come outside of our continent to study and learn, we are the key that can make the difference in our continent.
Carl?
Yes, very well said. I was going to make the same exact point, right? We've seen tremendous amount of change in the African continent over the last year in Ethiopia, in the Gambia, but that momentum needs to keep coming. And African countries can help establish democracy by ending the arbitrary detention of political opposition leaders,